The Depression was caused by government. It was a result of bad government. It was a result of government actions not working the way they were intended to. The Federal Reserve System was established in 1914 for the purpose of preventing things like the Great Depression. And yet, its existence was responsible, in my opinion, for the depth of the Depression. So that you cannot look at the after effect without looking at what came before. Given that you made the terrible mistakes that led to the Great Depression, I have never criticized the remedial actions that were taken immediately thereafter to help the people who were so badly hurt. That was a desirable thing, and it was a reaction to it. The bad things about the New Deal were not those. The bad things about the New Deal was not Works Progress Administration, which offered temporary jobs, the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was not the bad things. Those were good things. The bad things about the New Deal were the more permanent changes it introduced in the institutions of the country. One of them has recently come home to roost in the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. That's a strict New Deal consequence. That was established. Well, why was it established? If a private organization makes a mistake, does things badly, it will lose money and it will have to go out of business. If a public organization does things badly, and governmental organization does things badly and makes bad mistakes, it will be expanded. It will be expanded because they'll say, well, it's all because we just didn't have enough resources to it, or else it will be left to stand, and another organization will be set up to do what it was supposed to do. That is this case. The Federal Reserve System was established to prevent the bank runs and bank failures that happened during the Great Depression. But they made it worse, much worse, by not doing what they were setting up to do. They were supposed to provide liquidity, and instead they reduced liquidity. The quantity of money in the United States fell by a third between 1929 and 1933. The Federal Reserve System at all times during that period had the power to prevent that decline. And it was established for the purpose of preventing that from happening. It didn't do it. And so what happened? The Federal Reserve System wasn't abolished, unfortunately. But the Federal Deposit Insurance was created to do what the Federal Reserve System had been supposed to do, to prevent bank runs. I have never argued that government initiatives may not be just as good as private initiatives. The problem with government is not in the things it tries, but in the absence of any mechanism for recognizing error. What you need, what the private system abounds in, is survival of the fittest. What the governmental system abounds in is expansion of the mistakes. And there's no mechanism for eliminating governmental agencies which either have no longer are needed or have behaved perversely. If you try to think back and ask yourself, how many government agencies can you think of that have ever been abolished? I thought you could count those on the fingers of one hand. One of the government agencies that was abolished was there once existed a system of postal savings where the post offices held savings. How come it became abolished? Because when it was passed, the law was passed, it was passed that it could not pay, that it was limited to paying interest of a maximum of 2%. Now, during the Great Depression, that was wonderful because it was safe. And postal savings deposits expanded and became very large. During the later 30s, and particularly after the war, when interest rates started going up way above 2%, everybody took their money out of the postal savings. There was no more money in there, and it was allowed to die. Now, that's one of the very few examples of a government agency that has been eliminated. Can you name any others? Now, we don't have a free market, don't kid yourself. And the biggest enemies of a free market, the two biggest enemies of the free market are two separate groups, my academic colleagues and business people. Business people are enemies of free markets, not friends. The academic people are all in favor of freedom for themselves, except even now they aren't even in favor of that with this politically correct nonsense that's going around. But historically, academic people have always been in favor of freedom for themselves. They want to be able to say what they want, write what they want, do whatever research they want. But they're all against freedom for everybody else. They think that they know better what's good for the poor people than the poor people do. They think they can run the economy better than the businesses can. The business people are just the opposite. They're all in favor of freedom for everybody else. And at the drop of a hat, you can get any leading businessman to give you an eloquent speech on the virtues of free market. But when it comes to their own business, they want to go down to Washington and get a special tariff to protect their business. They want a special tax deduction. They want a tax subsidy. When Chrysler is on the verge of failing, which it should have done, it should have been allowed to fail, Chrysler goes down and exercises political influence to try to get the government to lend it money to subsidize. So businessmen in general, not all, there have been some notable exceptions, and I don't want to include everybody, just as not all intellectuals are in that class. But in the main, most businessmen are enemies of free markets. The real beneficiaries of free markets are the invisible man, the consumer, the ordinary worker. Those are the real people who benefit from free markets, but unfortunately, they don't have the kind of political clout that a PAC, Political Action Committee from big business has. One of the great economists of the 19th century was Alfred Marshall. And he has as a sort of motto for one of his books, the seen and the unseen. And it's a marvelous motto for this. What happens in economics over and over again is that there are two sets of effects of any action. The immediately visible effects and the widespread invisible effects. And the widespread invisible effects are often much more important than the visible ones. But people don't see them. Let me give you very simple examples. We have a quota on the amount of sugar that can be imported from various countries. The visible effect of that is that there are about a couple of 100,000 growers of beet sugar who benefit greatly from it, who are able to keep on growing beet sugar. They don't benefit so greatly because most of the money goes into paying the expenses of growing the beets. And indeed, if there were no such quota, they would find something else to do. But who believe, in the short run, appear, the visible effect is that they are able to have a market they would otherwise not have. The invisible effect is that every consumer in the United States pays twice as much for the sugar he or she buys as the world price. Now, you're a consumer. How much attention to the fact do you pay to the fact that you pay twice as much for sugar as you ought to? Is the fact that you pay twice as much for sugar as you ought to going to lead you to go down to Washington to testify against the sugar quota? But are the beet sugar farmers going to go down to Washington to testify in favor of the sugar quota? It's a typical example of the seen versus the unseen, the concentrated visible versus the dispersed invisible. And the major reason why roughly half the income of this country is controlled by governmental agencies instead of by the people who earn it is because of this contrast between the visible and the invisible. We talk about this, about a majority government. It is a majority government, but it's a very funny kind of a majority. It's a majority made up of a whole bunch of minorities. You've got 1/10 of 1% of the people who are beet sugar growers. They're part of this majority. You've got another 0.2%, maybe 1 or 2% of the people who are in the textile industry. And they make us pay twice the world price for shirts and for other things because of textile tariffs and textile agreement around the world. And so down the line, you've got all these specialists. You've got labor unions, you've got these and those. Each one separately is a little minority. But they all get together. Each minority is more interested in its own little problem than in what happens for the rest of the country, and so it's willing to give its vote to the other things. If they'll give it, it's a case of log rolling. So what we have is a log rolling majority, in which the majority of the people are not in fact represented. Is there any doubt in your mind? Suppose you were able to get an effective poll from the people at large on this question. The government imposes quotas on the import of sugar. The result of that is that X thousand farmers are able to grow beet sugar who otherwise would not, and that you are paying twice the world price for sugar. Are you in favor of this? Is there any doubt in your mind that a majority would say they're opposed to it? Let me give you another example which is much more important and much more dramatic. Of course, the most socialized industry in the United States is the military. But next to the military, the most socialized industry in the United States is schooling. 9 out of 10 of youngsters, leave for a moment the colleges and universities aside, although it's true for them too. But let's stick to elementary and secondary schooling. Everybody recognizes that over the course of decades, the amount of money that's going into that in real terms after adjustment for inflation has been going up per student very sharply. And everybody recognizes that the quality of education has been going down. There's not the slightest doubt. All socialist enterprises are the same. If you take them in Europe, whether you take them in Russia, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, or in the United States, socialized enterprises produce poor quality products at high prices but confer special benefits on small groups. That's a characteristic. One proposal for privatizing education, for improving it, is one that I made first some over 30 years ago in a book that I was published, well, it was in an article first, and then in a book that was published just about 30 years ago, is a voucher system which has gotten a lot of attention, which is simply the idea that parents should be able to decide what school their children go to. That what you should do is to say to every parent, if you send your child to a public school, to a government school, it's costing the taxpayer now roughly about $4,000 to $5,000 per student. So if you decide to send them to any other kind of a school, we'll give you a voucher worth $3,000 so we can make some money out of it too, let's say, just for an example, by which you can choose any school you want, governmental, private, non-profit, profit-making, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, whatever, any school you want. The parent should have the choice. Those of us who are in the upper income classes have that choice now, because we can afford to pay twice for schooling, once through taxes and once directly through tuition. The people who are hurt by the present system are the poor people, and the people who are hurt worst are those in the inner cities who cannot get a decent education for their children. Now, the voucher system, there have been quite a large number of public opinion polls about how people feel toward various proposals, including the voucher system. In every poll that has been taken, the group which gives the largest majority in favor of the voucher system are the blacks. The blacks vote 2-to-1 in favor of the voucher system. There is not a single black leader who has come out in favor of the voucher system. I once tried to persuade Jesse Jackson. I happened to be riding on a private plane with him from somewhere to Washington, I've forgotten from where, and I got him started on it. He acted as if he had never heard of the idea, but of course he had. Oh, it's a wonderful, splendid idea. Where do you send your own children? Well, several of them are going to private schools, of course. At any rate, you never heard another word from Jesse Jackson in favor of the voucher system. Why? Because where do the black leaders get their political clout? From being able to appoint people to school boards, from being able to get jobs in the school system for some of their people. They can get support out of the voters by voting for more money for education. But if once a voucher system were adopted, they would no longer have any political clout. And that is why every attempt to get a voucher system, and there have been many of them, has been destroyed and frustrated by the people with a vested interest in not having it, in particular the officials of the teachers' trade unions, of the state employees' unions, and the political people like Jesse Jackson and other such political leaders. But the reason I cite this example, and I think it's so dramatic, is because of the unwillingness of the black leaders to support something of which the major beneficiaries would be the people they're supposedly representing. There's a pot of money there in every one of these cases. And just as bees will go to honey, people will go to a pot of money. And the people who will be most effective in getting control of that pot of money are people who are trying to grab it for themselves rather than people who are trying to spend it on behalf of somebody else. Everybody wants to spend somebody else's money, and nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. That's a fundamental principle. There's only one way, in my opinion, in which you can exercise control over this process, and that's by effective constitutional limitation backed by public opinion. If it's not backed by public opinion, it will do no good. We have free speech because of the First Amendment of the Constitution. I would be, in our book, Free to Choose, we listed the amendments we would like to see in the Constitution. They're much broader than that. Such as that Congress shall make no laws prohibiting any trades between consenting individuals with respect to goods that it's legal to trade. Now, that would eliminate all tariffs. It would eliminate the sugar quota. That you may not see offhand that it would, but it would if you think about it a little, because individuals include foreign individuals and not only domestic individuals. So no, I would really like much broader constitutional limitations than just a limitation on and there are many other things you can think of. For example, you might have a constitutional amendment that nobody can be elected to Congress and Senate unless he's more than 60 years of age. That would eliminate the possibility of people being elected to Congress in order to be able to get benefits after they leave Congress. You see, that's the defect. I happen to be in favor of term limitation proposals simply because maybe that's a possible thing you can get. But the defect of term limitation proposals is you have young people who enter Congress and they're limited to 12 years. They'll use those 12 years to get brownie points with people on the outside who will give them a job later. So it would be much more effective to limit the legislature to people or to make it a part-time job or an unpaid job. Anyway, there are lots of solutions. I'm not going to go through the solutions here. Our books, Free to Choose, and earlier one, Capitalism and Freedom, are much better from that point of view than what I can say here. But what I will say, you will not solve these problems by taking them up on a one-by-one basis. You will never get rid of the sugar quotas by having sugar consumers testify against them. You might get a constitutional amendment that there shall be no tariffs or other interferences with foreign trade, which lumps everything together so people can see that they have a real interest in it. But if you try to do it piece by piece, you'll get killed every time. I would like to get rid of the Federal Reserve, too. I would like to have money controlled by a computer. However, that's not what's happening, and I'm a realist. You're going to have a Federal Reserve System, and therefore it's relevant to ask, given that there is a Federal Reserve System, even though it would be a better world if we could get rid of them, how should Federal Reserve operate? So I have been concerned with monetary policy by trying to see how to make it less harmful than it is likely to be. I don't want to say that government, it's necessary. There are certain things that it is essential for government to do. I'm not an anarchist. I believe in a government, but a limited government. And the government should be limited, in my opinion, to very simple functions. Number one, to defending the country against foreign enemies. I have tried for a long time to see how to make national defense a private enterprise, and I have never succeeded. It's easy to see how to privatize schooling, but I don't know how to privatize national defense. So I'm reconciled to the fact that we're going to have to pay twice as much as we should have to pay in order to get an effective national defense. Because anything government does, on the average, there's some things that are more, some less. On the average, anything government does costs twice as much as if it were being done by private enterprise. So, one function of government is to protect the country against foreign enemies, national defense. A second function of government, and one which it performs very, very badly, is to protect the individual citizen against abuse and coercion by other citizens, to keep you from being hit over the head, mugged on the street, your house broken into, and so on. And I believe that the government performs that function very ineffectively because it's doing so many things it has no business doing. The third function of government, a very important function, is to define the rules of the game we play. What's private property? If an airplane flies 10,000 feet over your house, is he violating your private property? If he flies 10 feet over your house, is he violating your private property? There's nothing natural about where the line should be drawn. So we have to have some mechanism for making the rules about that, and that is an appropriate government function. And fourth, it's appropriate for government to provide a mechanism for adjudicating disputes about the meaning of those rules, a judicial system. Those are the four essential functions of government, in my opinion, and those are the only functions that are essential. There may be some other areas in which, if you started with nothing more than that, government might conceivably do more good than harm. But from where you are now, if you could only move back in that direction, it would be marvelous. There's no way you're going to do it. The best you can hope for is that you can hold down government, keep it where it is, and let the private economy expand so that government becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of it. And even that is a very optimistic expectation, though it's possible. But going back to monetary policy, what is monetary policy concerned with? It's concerned fundamentally with what happens to the quantity of money. What's money? There's no natural definition of money. The first thing, money is whatever you use to engage in transactions, whatever it is that people are willing to accept. Not because they want it, but because they know that somebody else will accept it in return for something they want. And you know, in the history of the world, you can hardly name a commodity that has not been used as money at one time or another. There's an island in the Pacific which uses great big stones as money, the island of Yap. There are parts of Africa and India which for many centuries used cowrie shells, little shells that you pick up on the beach, as money. The colonies, Virginia and North Carolina and so on, those southern group colonies, for many years used tobacco as money. But of course, the thing that has mostly been used as money historically have been silver and gold as metals. But we've gotten beyond that, and now we use pieces of paper as money. The pieces of paper in your pocket, the equivalent of those, the deposits you have in your bank on which you think you can write checks and other people will accept your checks, or you can go down to an ATM and withdraw some cash. So that the sum of the paper you carry around in your pocket and in one or another class of deposits, and there are very different classes, is money. And the question is, who determines how much money there is? And the answer is, in our present system, there are 19 people who sit around a table in Washington once every 2 weeks who have the power, the unlimited power, to double the quantity of money over the next year or to cut it in half over the next year. Those 19 people are the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board and the 12 presidents of the Federal Reserve Banks, of the regional Federal Reserve Banks. Only 5 of those 12 presidents have a vote on that open market committee at any time, but all 12 attend every meeting and influence the action that occurs. They have the unquestioned power to do this. And it was the way they exercised that power during the Great Depression that was responsible for the depth of the Depression. It was the way they exercised that power during the 1970s that was responsible for the inflation during the 1970s, and is fundamentally responsible for the savings and loan debacle. So how they exercise that power makes an enormous amount of difference. And in my opinion, I shouldn't say opinion, because I have spent much of my life studying this. I've written or co-authored a series of books dealing with a major book dealing with the monetary history of the United States and others. So this is an opinion, but it's an informed opinion that is based on some evidence and work. The Federal Reserve, over the whole of its existence, has done much more harm than good. Yet, I want to give a tribute to Alan Greenspan, the present chairman of the Federal Reserve. As penance for my sins, I have read the statement of every chairman of the Federal Reserve Board since its beginning to Congress, when he reports to Congress. I hate to tell you how many of those I've read. Until Alan Greenspan alone, in not a single one of those did any chairman ever say, we may have made a mistake. Every one of those reports, when times were good and prosperity, they say, oh, we're responsible for what good times you have. In bad times, they say, oh, the times are bad in spite of us. We did everything we could to offset it. Even in the depth of the Depression in 1932 and 33, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board was saying, you cannot imagine how much worse things would have been if we hadn't done our duty. But Alan Greenspan is the first chairman of the Federal Reserve who, in public testimony before Congress, said, we may have made a mistake. And I give him very high marks for that. So, as I say, this has been a system which has done far more harm than good, and I am concerned with the question of how can we rein them in so that they do less harm and more good. And the problem is to exercise accountability, to make them accountable. And there are various ways in which this could be done. The main thing I have always argued for, and I'm not sure it's the best way, and indeed, a former student of mine has suggested what I now think is a better way, but what I've always argued for is requiring him to keep the quantity of money growing at a steady and relatively slow rate. Now, they've departed from that, and every single mistake is connected with a departure from that. Almost always. There are one or two occasions on which the departure was justified, but most of the time it has not been. And the problem is, how do you get that rule in law, and how do you make it accountable? How do you make it in the self-interest of the members of the board to follow the rule? As I say, there are various other ways that have been suggested, but that's the essential problem, is to impose rules which will keep the quantity of money from either growing very rapidly or declining very rapidly. Either the one or the other is bad. If it grows too rapidly, you have inflation. If it declines too rapidly, you have depression. You're not going to get rid of minor recessions. But even the present recession, in which we are now as we talk, has unquestionably been made deeper than it need be, because over the past 4 months, the Federal Reserve has let the money supply grow at a very, very low rate, much too low a rate. A lower rate, if the rate at which it's been growing over the past 4 months were maintained indefinitely, we would get not stable prices, but declining prices. And what we ought to aim for is a rate of growth of the money supply, which gives you relatively stable prices. They're always shifting their rhetoric. You have to distinguish rhetoric from substance. They've often talked about paying attention to money growth, but they almost never have done so. And that's because they come out of a banker mentality. And the banker mentality is to look at the Fed as a credit instrument and as having something to do with interest rates. It would be too complicated for this present purpose to explain that, but it's a major mistake, in my opinion. And I believe the Fed can influence interest rates, but it can't determine them. But it can determine what the quantity of money is. That's the one thing it can really control. And it ought to be judged on the basis of how well it does that one thing. It doesn't have a positive effect on our economic life. It eliminates a negative effect. Fluctuations in the rate of growth of the quantity of money produce uncertainty. They go up, and prices start to go up, and no individual businessman knows whether the price rise is because his product is in more demand and he should reduce it, or because there's more money around and there's going to be general inflation. He won't learn about that for months. And so, let me see if I can describe it in what I think is a proper kind of a metaphor. Consider listening to the radio. The problem that bothers you is static. What matters for the economy is what happens to relative prices and relative demands. What you want is a system under which if people suddenly decided that they want more of one thing and less of another, they want more computers and fewer automobiles. That's reflected in prices, relative prices. The price of computers goes up, the price of automobiles goes down. The producers of computers have an incentive to produce more computers. The producers of automobiles have an incentive to produce fewer automobiles. That's what the price system is like, and that's what it's for. Now, the effect of these fluctuations in the quantity of money is to introduce static into the signals that are coming out from the price system. It's as if when you listen to the radio, somebody is deliberately introducing static into that thing so you can't hear anything very clearly. And that's exactly what these fluctuations in the money supply do. A stable rate of monetary growth would not be a positive good. It would simply set a stable background against which the market could operate, and it would eliminate the static, the uncertainty that these short-term movements introduce. The aim is not to have business operate more profitably. The aim of our society is to have people better off. Profits are a means, not an end. And indeed, in a good society, it's very hard to make profits because you've got a lot of competition, you've got a lot of people trying to participate. We do have. But so far as Congress is concerned, at the moment, we are roughly 50% socialists. Government spending at all levels is now 43% of the national income. In addition, the government imposes regulations and rules on business that clearly take up another 10% or so of our income. So more than 50% of our resources are now being distributed and allocated by government. The best thing government could do, in my opinion, in order to promote the well-being of the consumers, which indeed would give more opportunity for entrepreneurs to get into business and to open up new business. The best thing government could do would be to cut its size. We have a great deal of downsizing by enterprises now. What we really need is downsizing by government. One more point. If you look at our real social problems, not our economic problems, but our social problems, almost all of them have been produced by government. We have one of our major problems, which has been mentioned, is that our school system is unsatisfactory. Why? Because in the main, it's a government monopoly. The private schools, on the whole, do a very much better job than government schools, just as socialism in general does a poorer job than private enterprise. What goes bad is that nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. That's fundamentally what goes bad. It isn't that people are bad. The same people, on the one hand, spending their own money, and on the other hand, spending somebody else's money, will behave very differently. Right. And what goes bad is that people are sincere. The people who run the school system want to do a good job. They aren't bad people. It's not that at all. But they have no competition. They don't have to prove themselves. And therefore, they tend to stress their own interests. In the case of the school system, of course, the main problem, a major problem, is the extent of influence of the teachers' unions. The National Education Association is the largest pressure group in the country. It has an annual income of $750 million, and it doesn't hesitate to spend that to try to promote its own interests. In fact, it's perfectly open and above board that its purpose is not to promote education. Its purpose is to promote the well-being of its members. And I don't blame them for that. That's what they're there for. But if you ask what goes wrong, in my opinion, that's what goes wrong. Free market principles apply. The reason we have a healthcare crisis is because we're not following free market principles. Why in the world should you buy your health at the company store? The company store is an old anachronism which people try to avoid. The only reason we get our health through our employers, in the main, is because there's a tax gimmick under which if the employer pays for it, the employee doesn't have to pay tax on it. Whereas if he pays for it himself, it has to come out of after-tax income. The proposal that would enable free market principles to work, see, the basic free market principle is that an individual spends his own money and decides what he wants to buy. That's not the free market principle you now have in health. People aren't spending their own money. The employer is spending it.
Well, I am, but
And
I seem to be the only.
Need, what's been proposed, and what I think would be a major step toward a free market system, would be the so-called meta-save accounts, whereby you'd retain this tax gimmick, but have the employer put the money in an account in an individual's own name, and he or she would be responsible himself for purchasing his medical care. And then that would enable free market principles to work. Look, we've had socialized medicine in Germany, in Sweden, in Britain, in Canada. All of these countries are having difficulty with it. There's not one of them that doesn't have long waiting periods, in which expenses have not been going up, in which you don't have a real problem. So we're not going to solve our medical problem by socializing. I think that what business is doing is creating the goods and services we use. I think it's misleading to talk about business. People are what matters. And the people who are in business are a sample of the people at large. And you might just as well ask, are other people around doing things for us? And there's nothing more important they're doing than providing the food on the table, the clothes that we wear, and everything else. Why is it that we're so much better off today in those areas than we were when I was growing up? It's primarily because of the efforts of private business. And yet, as a nation, fewer and fewer of our resources are being devoted to that kind of activity. And where we're wasting money is in trying to do things we can't do.
Okay.
We're wasting money on these people, agricultural experiment stations in every county, even though there is no agriculture there. I don't think you want to increase the value of your currency. What you want to do is to keep your currency having a relatively constant value. In your own country, the Czech Republic, under Václav Klaus, is showing a very good example to the rest of the world, because the Czech Republic has been doing a remarkable job, in my opinion. Of all of the Eastern European countries, it's probably been doing the best job. It has gone farthest in selling off state enterprises and converting them into private enterprises. The important thing is to have a currency which does not inflate, which keeps its value. And the only way you can do that is by not printing too much of it. There's one reason for inflation, and one only, ultimately, and that's creating too much money. Unfortunately, Poland has not been doing a good job in that respect. Hungary has been doing a moderate job, but I think the Czech Republic has, on the whole, doing rather the best job of the various ones. So, but don't imitate the United States. The United States is not the right model for you. The right model for you is a much more free enterprise society. I would say Hong Kong before the Chinese take over is the best model. Or the right model for you is the way you were in 1938 or 39. People forget that in 1938 or 39, Czechoslovakia was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with one of the highest incomes. It only took 40 years for communism to reduce it to the status of a third world country. No, we're going the wrong way. I've been putting it in a very simple syllogism. Everybody agrees that capitalism has been a success. Everybody agrees that socialism has been a failure. The conclusion, therefore, we need more socialism. Now, how do you make any sense out of that? You can't, and yet that's exactly what's been happening. Government has been getting bigger. Most of the proposals that are before Congress would involve more government involvement. The health care program is an obvious case. Why? The simple answer is because the people no longer run the government. The government has become a self-generating monstrosity. We don't have government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have government of the people, by the bureaucracy, for the bureaucracy. And by the bureaucracy, I include members of Congress, because being a member of Congress has become a lifetime career. Incumbents, it's very difficult to displace them. In order to change that, in order to follow the rest of the world and move in the direction that we ourselves pioneered toward a greater role for free markets and for individuals, we need to change the incentives under which government operates. In my opinion, the most promising movement at the moment to produce such a change is the term limits movement, which has been moving like wildfire. State after state has passed a term limit amendment for its constitution. I'm very optimistic about the long run because I think the public at large recognizes what's wrong. The people know the government is too big and needs to be cut down. And sooner or later, the people are going to have their say. Of course I'm saying I know the answers. I don't deny that. But I don't have any right to make you agree with me. All I have the right to do is to present as best I can my side of the case and to try to persuade you. And of course, I know the answers, but I also know they may be wrong. And if you can persuade me they're wrong, well, then I'll gladly shift my view. And you have just as much right to your view that you know the answers as I do to my view that I do. Now, obviously, what's involved all along is that when you say you know the answers, it's about some things. And the degree of confidence that you have will vary enormously. If you express yourself, as people often do, on things on which they have no confidence, they should have a very low degree of confidence in what they say. If I say, for example, the war in the Gulf is going to be over in a week, I don't have any great confidence in that. Who am I? I'm not a military expert. I don't know what's going on. But nonetheless, I'm entitled to make a judgment, provided I recognize the tentative character of it. On the other hand, when I say if you print a lot of money, you're going to have inflation, my confidence in that is enormously higher because I can cite hundreds of examples to show that that is exactly what happened and essentially no examples on the other side. But still, I might be wrong. There might be something that comes along that alters that, so I don't doubt that. But still, I have a great deal of confidence in it. The point is, no, we never can know for certain. We think the sun will rise tomorrow. Why? Because it has risen for hundreds of millions of days. But you can't say without that it's absolutely certainly will rise tomorrow. I have a great deal of confidence that it will rise tomorrow, but that doesn't mean that's absolute truth. There is no such thing as absolute truth. Equally true of every so-called, what people think are really hard scientific statements. Sir Karl Popper, famous philosopher, and particularly of scientific methodology, has his book called Conjectures and Refutations. And that's the right notion. Well, a scientific hypothesis is a conjecture. It's not a certainty. When I say, if you print a lot of money, you're going to have inflation, that's a conjecture. And I will continue to believe it until it's refuted by some evidence. But it's not an absolute truth. Now, how much confidence you have in a conjecture will depend on how often you have had evidence supporting it, but most important, how often it has had the opportunity to be refuted without having been refuted. So far as my personal experience is concerned, as I mentioned before, the New Deal was a great benefit to me. The New Deal gave me my first job after. In fact, the New Deal, as I say, may well have been harmful for the economy, but it was very beneficial for me. I got a job there, earned more money than I'd ever earned before, was able to work on things I was interested in, was able to write some articles that were published and establish a little bit of a scientific reputation. And again, after I left Washington in the mid-30s, I went back during the war, worked at the Treasury for 2 years from 41 to 43, worked as a mathematical statistician for 2 years from 43 to 45, so that I personally have been a beneficiary of governmental activity. So there's nothing personal in it whatsoever. It's entirely a result of what I believe is evidence and analysis, theory and analysis. The government, on the one hand, subsidizes the growers of tobacco. On the other hand, it spends the taxpayers' money to propagandize against smoking. The right hand and the left hand are offsetting one another. You're wasting resources. The government is spending the taxpayers' money to keep the price of milk at twice what it need be, of fluid milk, by milk marketing orders, dairy controls, farm price supports. At the same time, it's subsidizing food stamps and school lunches to enable people to pay that high price of milk. What it's spending with this hand is offsetting what it's doing with this hand. So most government expenditures are doing harm not because they're creating uncertainty, but because they're the equivalent of hiring people to dig holes and hiring other people to fill those holes up, because they're producing no economic product. Look, at the present time in the United States, governments at all levels are spending an amount of money equal to 43% of the national income. Is there a citizen of the United States who thinks he's getting 43% of his welfare from what the government is doing? People find it hard to believe that. Why? Because that government activity is so wasteful and so inefficient that the 50% or so that the private sector is providing, it accounts for 90% of his welfare, of the things he really uses and can use. It isn't the fact that the government is wasting money on delivering mail inefficiently because it has a monopoly, is not producing uncertainty, it's just wasting the taxpayers' money. And you can go down the line. So that I don't want it to be thought that the main problem with government is that it produces uncertainty. That's the main problem with the monetary policy, but not with government in general. It's an interesting phenomenon that policy follows opinion, but only with about a 20-year lag. And the first example of that, of course, was a reaction to the Great Depression. Because during the whole of the 1920s and even earlier, intellectual opinion had been shifting towards socialism. In Britain, with the Fabian Society, in the United States, people don't realize that every economic platform, every economic plank of the Socialist Party platform of 1928 is now part of law. So, intellectual opinion was shifting towards socialism. Public opinion was not of that thing. The Great Depression had the major effect it did because it made people, public opinion, accept that intellectual opinion and say, oh, we had a Great Depression because the private enterprise system failed on us, and we need to call government to our aid, and these intellectuals who were talking about having government play a larger role were really right. And so policy started to shift toward bigger and bigger government and more centralized government. But as it did so, people started getting disillusioned, and particularly small groups of intellectuals around the world started getting disillusioned. And intellectual opinion started to shift the other way. Let me give you a dramatic example. Ronald Reagan was preaching the same thing in 1964 when he spoke on behalf of Goldwater as he was preaching when he was elected president in 1980. He could not have been elected on that platform in 1964. He is the only president in my lifetime who was elected not because he was saying what the people wanted to hear, but because the people had come around to wanting to hear what he was saying. He hadn't changed his opinions, but the public at large was getting fed up with what? With higher and higher taxes. With what? With inflation produced by government. With what? Increasing rules and regulations and governmental bureaucratic controls. So public opinion was beginning to share what had been happening in intellectual opinion. And once public opinion starts moving in that direction, with a lag of a decade or two, policy will follow. And that's why I was very optimistic that there was going to be a greater role for markets. More optimistic than was justified. We haven't achieved as much as I would have anticipated or expected. We have moved somewhat in that direction, but the greatest successes in that area have not come in the West. And indeed, well, I'll come back to that, but they've come in the East, obviously. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary is the most hopeful thing for human life, human policy, that has happened in my lifetime. It carries with it, however, problems for the United States. On the whole, I think it's been a bad thing for the United States because it's introduced complacency in the United States. We've been inclined to say, look at this. These people, our system has been working and theirs hasn't. And therefore what we've been doing, everything we've been doing must be right. I summarize this in the form of 3 propositions that are widely believed. Number 1, socialism is a failure. Everybody believes that now. Number 2, capitalism has been a success in enabling people to have a higher level of income and a higher degree of freedom. Everybody believes that. Proposition number 3. Therefore, the United States needs more socialism. Hard to render that consistent with the first 2 propositions, and yet it's what people believe. You don't hear talk in Washington about having more capitalism. You hear talk in Washington about how we need to have more government spending on schools. We need to have a stricter enforcement of drug prohibition. We need to have child care methods. We need to have the government pass Clean Air Acts. But if they were really taking the lessons of what's happened in Eastern Europe, they would be saying, or the people would be requiring their representatives in Washington to say, we should abolish Amtrak, we should get rid of farm subsidies, we should eliminate tariffs, we should cut the government down to size. But that's not what anybody is saying, although that's the lesson that is taught. Problems in the United States are exactly the same as the problems with the Soviet Union, with Poland and the others. The difference is that they were 100% socialist and we're only 50% socialist. But just as their 100% socialism produced problems that was beyond belief, every major problem in the United States, in my opinion, is coming from the 50% of our society that's socialist. I've mentioned education, which I think is, people talk about problems like budget deficits, like foreign trade deficits, and so on. Those aren't the real problems of the United States. The real problems in the United States are in education, which is disgraceful. We are spending more money on education per capita than any other country in the world, and we are getting poorer results. And we need to privatize it. The second major problem in the United States arises out of the attempt to prohibit the use of drugs. I have estimated that there are 10,000 deaths a year through homicides because of the attempt to enforce drug prohibition. That's not a number pulled out of the sky. It's based on a comparison of the rate of homicides during the 50s, when there was little attempt to enforce drug prohibition, and the rate of homicide during the 80s, after you had first the drug war declared by Nixon, and then by each successive president since then. Drugs are a terrible curse. I'm not suggesting that they're a good thing or anything, but far more harm is being done by making them illegal than good. We are destroying our inner cities. We're destroying the life of people. We're killing people because of the wars being fought by the drugs. Because why? Because we create such enormous profit opportunities which would otherwise not exist. And more than that, I find it hard how anybody can justify the United States destroying a country like Colombia in Latin America because we cannot enforce our own laws. If we could enforce our own laws, there'd be no problem in Colombia. But we can't enforce them. And so we destroy Colombia. How can you justify that? It's disgraceful. And we can go on and on and on with that. But there's no question in my mind that far more harm than good is being done. And that you would have less drug addiction and less harm from drug addiction in a world in which it was decriminalized than in the present world. We went through this once with prohibition in the 1920s and 30s. Why do we have to go through it again? Because people seem not to be able to learn from experience. That's another problem, and that's traceable to government. The savings and loan debacle, traceable to government, obviously. It was the inflation of the 70s, plus a set of rules and regulations under which the government said to the savings and loans, we'll play heads you win, tails I lose. So that. Now, we have a problem of infrastructure. It's a fascinating thing. In the 1930s, out here in San Francisco, they were able to build the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge. People say we couldn't afford to do that now. But we're 3 times as wealthy now as we were then. How come we could afford to do it then? The answer is because the government wasn't doing all the other things that it has no business doing. And you could go down the line. So the problems we have are primarily problems created by ourselves, by that socialist sector, of exactly the same character as the problems created in Eastern Europe by a 100% socialist sector. And that's why when I was in Poland not a few months ago and I gave a talk there, the title of my talk was Why the United States is Not the Right Model for Poland. What the right model for Poland is the United States 100 years ago, or Hong Kong before the Chinese started taking it over more recently. It is a right model that we can afford all the nonsense and the harm that government is doing because we had 100 years of a real free market on which to build up our wealth, and therefore we're wealthy enough to afford to waste half of our product. But Poland isn't wealthy enough to do that. Czechoslovakia isn't wealthy enough to do that. If you want to see the power of institutions, just look at how it is that 30 years of socialism can convert Czechoslovakia from one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which it was in the 1930s. It had higher income than Britain. It was on a level with the United States. 30 or 40 years of socialism can convert Czechoslovakia from one of the wealthiest countries in the world to a third world country. 40 years of socialism can produce a West and East Germany, coming from the same background, the same source, starting from the same point, which are as wide apart as they are. And if we keep on with our 50% socialism and make it 60 and 70, it'll do the same, have the same destructive effects in this country. If you look back, the period of the 19th century, let's say 1870 to 1914, the period of the greatest amount of private charitable activity in the history of the world. Carnegie libraries, private hospitals. It's a very interesting exercise to go down and look in the World Almanac at the list of non-profit institutions and when they were founded. Boy Scouts, Red Cross. You go down all of the list. Those non-profit institutions which are devoted to helping people were all founded in the 19th century, early 20th century. The ones that were founded after 1920, and particularly after the 1930s, were primarily professional organizations, associations devoted to special interests. Very few organizations devoted to helping people, like the Salvation Army or the Red Cross or what I've described before, are founded after that. Government has taken over responsibility for it. People say, why should I have to contribute to that? The government is doing that. I'm paying tax money. So what's happened? It's not that people have become less willing to make voluntary grants, but they've gone in a different direction. People now give money to museums, to art institutes, to symphony orchestras and so on, but they don't give money to help the poor because that's the government's taken over that function. Whereas before 1914, a much larger fraction of all donations were of that kind and were of a personal kind in which people took a personal interest. There's an enormous amount of voluntary activity going on in this country, charitable, but some of it is co-opted by the government, is essentially a contribution to governmental functions, like assisting in the government schools and the inefficient government schools. And much of it goes into the kinds of other activities I've described, which really have a wholly different purpose, cultural as opposed to eleemosynary. Economics is one discipline among many. I'm not saying every young man, there isn't room for everybody in economics. Some people will find they're interested in economics. Some people are interested in physics. Some people are interested in mathematics. The important thing is for people to try to find an activity in which, as I said before, they are going to get paid for doing something they enjoy doing. They ought to try to find an activity in which they want to work overtime. If they can learn more about the way the world works, they can contribute to forming a public opinion which will be in favor of things that will help the society instead of hurt it. It's very simple. Economists have regarded as one of their main functions over more than 200 years to try to persuade the people that free trade is better than protectionism. They have never succeeded. But yet, if they had not been doing that, I'm sure we'd have a lot more protectionism than we do now. I sound like one of these presidents of the Federal Reserve System, and I don't like that. But I think it is true that we're not going to succeed. We're going to preach. We're going to preach on the basis of what we believe to be real evidence. 99% of the economists believe in free trade. And there's very little disagreement on that. That's why I chose that. And we'll have a little effect. But that little effect will pay our salaries and will more than compensate society for having provided us with food and clothing and housing and a little bit of extras for luxuries. You develop your own capacities. You do what you want to do. Don't do anything because you think it's going to help other people. Because you may be wrong. How the devil do you know what's good for other people? But you know what's good for you. You know what you really enjoy doing. You know what your talents are and what your qualities are. You develop your own qualities and your own talents, and the sum of a lot of people doing that will be a beautiful society. And don't waste your efforts on trying to tell other people what's good for them. What fascinates me so about the economic system is that the fundamental principles are so simple. You feel as if anybody can learn in 2 days the basic fundamentals of economics. They're very simple. The elementary principles of economics are trivial. People can spend their own money better than they can spend more carefully than they'll spend anybody else's. Buy low, sell high, go down. The principles are very simple. And yet, It seems to be so hard for people to understand them. And people so often get them wrong. And the major reason they do, and this is what is really fascinating, is that almost always what's true for the individual is the opposite of what's true for everybody put together. You go down the street and you buy some strawberries. You think you can buy as many strawberries as you want at the price that's posted, and you're right. But let's suppose everybody in the country tried to buy more strawberries. There wouldn't be any more strawberries. The total quantity of strawberries is fixed. The price would have to go up. So from the point of view of the individual, the quantity is variable and the price is fixed. For everybody together, the quantity is fixed and the price is variable. And what's true for strawberries is true for almost everything you can think of. And that's why, in my opinion, ordinary people are so subject to economic fallacies, because they tend to extrapolate from what's true for them as an individual for what's true for everybody. And almost always that's a wrong extrapolation. Oh, it's human behavior, but it's not psychology. Okay. And the reason it's not is because psychology is concerned with the individual. Economics is concerned with a collection of people. And that's why it's not psychology. It's because it's average behavior that we're looking at, whereas the psychologist is looking at the individual. And the aberrations that will be of most interest to the psychologist will average out from the point of view of the economist. So it's not about psychology. I wrote and talked and objected strenuously to the political policies that General Pinochet was following, but he was following the correct economic policies. And Chile is today the healthiest country in Latin America. And today, it's also a democratic country, and the dictatorship has been overthrown, and it's been overthrown because they followed the right economic policies. Pinochet didn't realize it, but he was sowing the seeds of his own destruction. The real miracle in Chile is that a dictatorship was willing to follow good economic policies. Most dictatorships are not willing to do that, and the reason is very simple. Good economic policies come from the bottom up. The consumers, the individual workers, are the people who determine what happens. But a dictatorship is from the top down. And top-down people don't want to accept bottom-up policies. And that's why I wrote in Newsweek back at that time, contemporaneously, that the real miracle in Chile was that Pinochet was willing to follow good economic policies. Good economic policies will establish conditions that will permit political freedom. But political freedom will sometimes lead to the destruction of the economic policies. Just as in the United States, the good economic policies are a good economic system, not the policies, the institutions. The institutions of private property, which is the essence, and freedom to trade and freedom to buy and sell, created the conditions which supported political freedom in the United States throughout its history. But political freedom in the United States has now been producing the conditions which over the last 50 years destroyed much of the economic system, took over half of it. So that time and again, just as people are suicidal in their impulses, just as business enterprises are suicidal in their impulses, they favor government policies like tariffs and subsidies, which will destroy the very basis of their existence. And they are suicidal. So the relationship between, I must say, this is one area in which I have changed my views drastically over the years. I used to say that economic freedom is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for political freedom. That's a true statement. But I also used to believe that economic freedom and political freedom went together in the sense that political freedom contributed to economic freedom and vice versa. I no longer believe that. I believe there's a very strong tendency that has to be fought all the time for political freedom to lead to the destruction of economic freedom. Now let me emphasize, I believe very strongly in freedom, both political and economic. But I think you have to be more sophisticated. You have economic freedom, and you have human freedom, and you can have human freedom without political freedom. And then you have political freedom in the sense in which we mean it, that people can vote for their own leaders. Hong Kong is a marvelous case in point. No political freedom whatsoever, but yet the most extensive human freedom. Probably no place on earth where people were freer to speak, to write, to talk, to say anything they wanted before the Chinese took over from the British. Pure accident because of the accidental colonial people who were appointed to govern. So you can have human freedom without political freedom. You can have economic freedom without political freedom. But you cannot have political freedom without a large measure of economic freedom.